Imagine a voice so powerful, it spoke for the silenced, so fearless that it challenged the very forces built to suppress it. Now imagine that same voice brutally silenced in the dead of night. This is the story of Marielle Franco, a woman who became more than a politician. She was a living symbol of hope for the oppressed, a relentless fighter for the rights of those often overlooked, and a fearless critic of Brazil's most dangerous power structures. Her life was a testament to courage in the face of injustice. But her murder? That was something darker, calculated, sinister, and still unresolved. Today, we're not just talking about the killing, we're diving into the story of a woman who stood up to the system and paid the ultimate price for it. Marielle Franco's journey started in one of the most notorious slums of Rio de Janeiro, the Maré Favela. Born into poverty, she was surrounded by violence, crime, and the everyday struggles of a marginalized community. Yet, instead of being swallowed by her circumstances, Marielle chose to fight. She understood the deep-rooted injustice that trapped the people of the favelas, particularly black Brazilians, women, and members of the LGBTQ community. Her activism wasn't born out of academic theory, it came from lived experience. Franco knew firsthand the brutality of police violence, the harsh realities of growing up in a system that viewed her, her family, and her neighbors as disposable. This background shaped her into one of Brazil's most influential voices for change, but also one of its most hated by those invested in maintaining the status quo. Earning a degree in sociology, Franco quickly transitioned into activism, working tirelessly to expose and fight against the deep inequalities in Brazilian society. Her eventual rise to become a city councilwoman in Rio de Janeiro wasn't just a political victory. It was a triumph for every person in Brazil who felt unseen, unheard, and unprotected. Marielle was more than a politician. She was a voice that could no longer be ignored. But in a country where systemic corruption, police brutality, and militarization are deeply entrenched, her outspokenness became dangerous. She wasn't just critiquing the system, she was threatening to dismantle it piece by piece. For some, Marielle Franco's activism wasn't a call for justice, it was a direct threat to their power and wealth, and that made her a target. This brings us to a chilling question. When does a voice for justice become so dangerous that it must be silenced? As Marielle Franco's voice grew louder, Brazil's political landscape was undergoing a dangerous shift, one that made her activism not only controversial but potentially fatal. In the years leading up to her assassination, Brazil was caught in a whirlwind of political turmoil. Right-wing ideologies were gaining ground, and with them came a surge in support for the militarization of law enforcement. In a country plagued by economic inequality, rising crime rates, and political corruption, the solution proposed by many in power was not reform, but repression. It was a time when calling out state-sponsored violence meant placing a target on your back. The Brazilian government, under pressure to crack down on crime, increasingly turned to brutal tactics, particularly in the favelas. These were communities like Maré, where Franco had grown up poor, predominantly black, and long neglected by the state. To the elite and those in power, the residents of the favelas were often seen as little more than collateral damage in their fight to restore order. And anyone who stood up for them, anyone who dared to demand justice, was a threat. Franco's criticism of police brutality was not just an intellectual stance, it was personal. She had seen, time and again, how Brazil's militarized police forces treated black Brazilians, poor residents, and anyone who dared to question their authority. Her activism highlighted what many in power wanted to keep hidden, that the real threat to Brazilian society wasn't the residents of the favelas, but the unchecked violence of those meant to protect them. At the time of her assassination, Brazil's political climate was teetering between democracy and authoritarianism. Figures with hardline stances on crime, backed by wealthy political elites, were pushing for more aggressive tactics, more militarization, more control. Franco stood in direct opposition to this, advocating for the rights of the very people these elites saw as expendable. Her calls for accountability and transparency struck at the heart of a deeply corrupt system, and for those in power, that made her dangerous. The rise of right wing political figures emboldened conservative forces who saw Franco's activism as more than just inconvenient, it was destabilizing. Her critiques of state violence weren't simply words, they were a threat to the way things had always been done. And in a society where challenging the status quo could cost you everything, Marielle Franco's fight for justice placed her on a collision course with those who held the reins of power. In this increasingly polarized atmosphere, where any call for reform was painted as an attack on national security, Marielle's voice became a beacon of resistance, but it was also a beacon that some wanted extinguished. The stage was set for a tragic confrontation, one where speaking truth to power could prove deadly. March 14th in the year 2018. A warm evening in Rio de Janeiro, yet the city would soon be gripped by a cold-blooded act of violence that would send shockwaves across the nation. Marielle Franco had just left an event, a gathering focused on empowering black women. It was the kind of event that represented everything Marielle stood for, giving voice to the silenced, uplifting those who had been systematically pushed to the margins. As the evening ended, Marielle and her driver, Anderson Gomes, set off into the night, unaware of the deadly plot unfolding in the shadows. The car rolled through the dimly lit streets of Rio, but unbeknownst to them, they were being followed. Whoever orchestrated this hit knew where she'd be, knew her route, and knew exactly when to strike. This was not a random attack. It was precise. It was planned. Suddenly, the quiet of the night was shattered by gunfire 13 shots, all fired with terrifying accuracy. The bullets tore through the car, shattering the windows and leaving no chance for escape. Marielle was hit 4 times, 3 of those rounds striking her in the head. Anderson Gomes was also killed instantly. The brutal efficiency of the attack left no doubt this was an execution. But this was no ordinary assassination. The level of coordination, the cold precision, and the fact that not a single thing was left to chance it all pointed to one chilling fact. Whoever pulled the trigger wasn't acting alone. This was a hit carried out with military precision, likely orchestrated by forces that understood both the stakes and the message this killing would send. Marielle Franco wasn't just murdered, she was silenced in the most brutal way possible. The killers had made sure of one thing: they didn't just aim to end her life, they aimed to snuff out what she represented. The bullets that pierced her body were meant to do more than kill, they were meant to send a message. They were meant to silence the voice of a woman who had dared to speak out against powerful forces, to challenge the impunity of the police, to lift up the voices of the oppressed. And as her car sat mangled in the streets of Rio, it became clear. This was an act of terror, a statement that those who dare to stand against the powerful, those who threaten the established order, can be eliminated at will. The scene that night was one of chaos and horror, but what made it all the more chilling was the eerie sense of precision, the clear knowledge that this was no spur of the moment attack. It was a calculated execution, a decision made long before the first bullet was fired, and the people responsible. They remained in the shadows, untouched by justice, while Marielle Franco's body lay lifeless, a symbol of what happens when the powerful feel threatened. The shots that rang out that night weren't just meant to kill a woman, they were meant to silence a movement. A movement that dared to challenge the brutality and corruption that had become entrenched in Brazil's political system. But what those behind the assassination didn't realize was that by ending Marielle's life, they sparked a fire that would burn far beyond that night. In the aftermath of Marielle Franco's assassination, Brazil was left in shock and grief, but that quickly turned to demands for justice. The streets filled with protests, voices calling for accountability, for answers. Yet, as the investigation into her murder began, it became clear that finding the truth would not be simple. The deeper investigators dug, the more tangled the web of deceit, corruption, and political manipulation became. From the outset, there were signs that this was no ordinary case. Marielle was a high profile figure, and her murder had all the hallmarks of a professional hit. Yet those investigating the crime found themselves facing roadblocks almost immediately. Initial leads seemed promising, but every step forward came with new layers of complication. The police slowly began to piece together the sequence of events from that fateful night, tracing the bullets and reconstructing the ambush. But even in these early stages, suspicions were swirling. This was not just about who pulled the trigger. The bigger question lingered: who ordered the hit? As investigators combed through surveillance footage, examined the ballistic evidence, and questioned potential witnesses, what they encountered was more than just dead ends. It was as if someone or something was intentionally obscuring the truth. Rumors of police involvement began to circulate. The level of precision, the knowledge of Marielle's movements, it all suggested that whoever was responsible had access to resources far beyond what a common criminal could muster. But with these suspicions came another harsh reality. Investigating the very institutions tasked with protecting the public was a dangerous proposition. Brazil's political elite had long been intertwined with its security forces. Corruption within the police was nothing new, but now, in the context of Marielle's assassination, it took on a new level of significance. Investigators began to look at the possibility of paramilitary groups, often composed of former police officers, being involved. These groups had a history of operating in Rio's favelas, exerting control through violence and intimidation, all while maintaining ties to political figures. The idea that Marielle's activism, her fight against police violence and corruption, had made her a target was becoming impossible to ignore. Yet, as these leads surfaced, so did obstacles. The investigation began to stall, with key pieces of evidence mysteriously delayed or dismissed. It was as if every time the case seemed to move forward, it was pulled back by unseen hands. Witnesses who could have provided critical testimony disappeared, some claiming they feared for their lives. Others remained silent, either out of loyalty or fear of retribution. As more time passed, it became clear that this was not a straightforward investigation. The specter of political interference loomed large. The question on everyone's mind was, how high did the corruption go? Was it just rogue officers, or were there powerful political figures pulling the strings? The deeper investigators looked, the more they realized this wasn't just about solving a murder. It was about unmasking a system built to protect the guilty. And then came the arrests. A year after Marielle's assassination, two former police officers, Ronnie Lessa and Elcio Vieira de Queiroz, were taken into custody. Lessa, a sniper with a history of violence, was accused of firing the fatal shots, while Vieira was believed to have been driving the car that tailed Marielle's vehicle. On the surface, it seemed like a breakthrough. The men responsible had been found, and justice appeared to be within reach. But for many, these arrests only deepened the mystery. Were Lessa and Vieira the masterminds behind the killing, or merely the hired hands? And if they were just the executioners, then who had given the order? The trail of suspicion pointed higher, to the very political elites that Marielle had challenged in her fight for justice. The investigation into Marielle Franco's murder became more than just a search for killers. It became a symbol of Brazil's battle with its own dark underbelly, a system where corruption ran so deep that even the murder of a high-profile politician could be buried under layers of deceit. As the case dragged on, it became painfully clear. The answers to Marielle's death were not just buried in forensic evidence or confessions. They were buried in the very structures of power she had spent her life trying to dismantle. With the investigation stalled and suspicions growing, one question continued to haunt the people of Brazil: who really ordered the assassination of Marielle Franco? And why, after all this time, did justice still seem so far out of reach? As the investigation into Marielle Franco's assassination dragged on, One question continued to burn in the minds of those seeking justice. Why was she killed? The arrests of Ronnie Lessa and Ilcio Vieira de Queiroz provided answers about how she was murdered, but they left an even bigger mystery untouched. Why? What could drive such a calculated, brutal killing? The deeper we look into Marielle's life and her activism, the answer becomes clearer. It wasn't just personal hatred or random violence. This was about something much more insidious: political greed and the hunger for power. Marielle Franco wasn't just another politician. Her work directly threatened the foundations upon which Brazil's most powerful elites built their control. In a country where the gap between rich and poor is vast, and where the lines between the police, politics, and criminal organizations often blur, Marielle's mission to expose corruption struck at the heart of the system. She wasn't just fighting for the people, she was fighting against the system itself, and that made her dangerous. Her relentless advocacy for the marginalized Afro-Brazilian communities, LGBTQ plus people, women, and Favela residents was a direct challenge to those in power. But more importantly, her vocal criticism of Brazil's militarized police forces and the corrupt political structures tied to them made her a threat to those who profited from this corrupt nexus. For years, paramilitary groups, often made up of ex-police officers, had operated in Rio's favelas with near impunity, exerting control over these communities through fear and violence. These groups weren't just operating in the shadows. They had ties to powerful political figures who benefited from keeping these areas under tight control. By standing up for the people of the favelas and exposing the abuses of police forces, Marielle was shaking the foundation of this corrupt arrangement. Her voice, amplified by her growing political influence, had the potential to unravel the very structures that allowed politicians, paramilitary groups, and corrupt law enforcement officials to maintain control over these communities. She wasn't simply challenging police brutality, she was threatening an entire system built on exploitation and fear. For Brazil's elites, maintaining the status quo wasn't just about political power, it was about money. The favelas, long seen as dangerous and lawless, were also spaces where paramilitary groups extorted residents, ran illegal businesses, and manipulated local elections. The economic interests tied to these power structures ran deep, and Marielle's calls for reform endangered that flow of money. By advocating for police accountability and transparency, she was threatening to expose the financial and political networks that thrived off the exploitation of Brazil's most vulnerable populations. Marielle's murder wasn't just an act of silencing a critic, it was about protecting those financial and political interests. The elites who benefited from the militarization of the favelas, the ones who profited from the violence and control over these communities, had the most to lose if Marielle's voice continued to grow. Her assassination sent a clear message to other activists: challenging the system comes with consequences. It wasn't just about Marielle as a person, it was about what she represented: a growing movement that could upend the corrupt, deeply rooted power dynamics in Brazil. Her rise to prominence as a politician was seen as a beacon of hope for many, but for others it was a dangerous development that had to be stopped. The fact that Marielle was Afro-Brazilian, a woman, and openly bisexual only added to the layers of resistance she faced. She embodied everything that the traditional power structure sought to suppress: diversity, inclusivity, and justice for those long ignored by the political elite. In her rise, they saw a shift they couldn't afford to let happen. What made Marielle truly dangerous, however, wasn't just her voice. It was her ability to galvanize others. Her platform wasn't confined to her seat on the Rio City Council. It was a movement, one that had the potential to mobilize Brazil's marginalized populations in a way that could fundamentally alter the political landscape. She was turning the disenfranchised into a political force, and that terrified those who held power. So was Marielle Franco murdered because of political greed? The evidence certainly points in that direction. Her activism wasn't just inconvenient for those in power, it was threatening their very survival. By advocating for transparency, police reform, and the rights of marginalized communities, Marielle was calling out the people who profited from the oppression and violence in Brazil's most vulnerable areas. In their eyes, eliminating her wasn't just a way to silence a voice of dissent, it was a calculated move to protect their control, their money, and their influence. As we dig deeper into the reasons behind her murder, one thing becomes clear. Marielle Franco's death wasn't just the result of a rogue hit or random violence. It was the product of a system built on corruption, greed, and fear of losing power. Her voice was too powerful, too persistent, and too disruptive to be allowed to continue. And for those who profited from the old ways, eliminating Marielle was a cold, strategic decision to safeguard their interests at all costs. More than a year after the cold-blooded assassination of Marielle Franco, a glimmer of justice seemed to emerge. In March 2019, two men were arrested and charged with her murder. Ronnie Lessa, a former military police officer with a history of violence, and Ilcio Vieira de Queiroz, another ex-officer with ties to the underworld of paramilitary operations. Their arrests sent ripples through Brazil, but instead of bringing closure, it only deepened the mystery surrounding Marielle's death. These two men might have pulled the trigger, but many were left wondering. Were they the true architects of this crime, or were they simply pawns in a much larger and more sinister game? Ronnie Lessa, the alleged shooter, was no stranger to violence. A former sniper with a reputation for deadly precision, he had operated in the shadows of Rio's most dangerous territories. His background was the perfect match for the meticulous execution-style murder of Marielle Franco. The planning, the surveillance, the coordination, it all fit the profile of someone like Lessa, a man well versed in military operations. Then there was Ilcio Vieira de Queiroz, believed to be driving the vehicle that tailed Marielle's car that fateful night. His role as the accomplice was clear, but as the investigation deepened, doubts surfaced. These two men were professionals, yes, but was it their personal vendetta against Marielle that led to this murder, or were they merely the instruments of someone else's plan? For many, the arrests felt like a carefully orchestrated move to provide the public with answers, but not the full truth. The evidence against Lessa and Vieira was strong enough to implicate them in the physical act of the murder, but the bigger question, the one that still haunted Brazil, remained unanswered. Who ordered the hit? From the beginning, it seemed improbable that Lessa and Vieira were acting on their own. They didn't have a clear motive to target Marielle themselves. She wasn't personally connected to them, nor was there any indication that her activism had directly impacted their lives. So why would these two former police officers, both with ties to Rio's dark underworld, risk everything to assassinate a politician whose platform focused on human rights, police accountability, and social justice? The answer, many believe, lies in the system that these men were a part of a system steeped in corruption, driven by greed, and protected by powerful political figures. The possibility that they were hired to carry out the assassination is a theory that can't be ignored. Brazil's history of paramilitary groups, often made up of ex-police officers like Lessa and Vieira, has long been linked to organized crime and corruption. These groups wield immense power in Rio's favelas, operating outside the law while maintaining deep ties to local politicians and business elites. Marielle's outspoken criticism of these groups, her fight to expose the abuses of the police and their connections to these paramilitary forces made her a prime target. The narrative that Lessa and Vieira acted alone is too simple. The planning behind Marielle's murder was far too complex, involving surveillance, tracking, and precision execution. These weren't the actions of men with personal grudges. They were professionals carrying out a contract, a hit ordered from the shadows by those who stood to lose the most if Marielle's fight for justice continued. But the arrests of Lessa and Vieira, while significant, only raised more questions. If they were hired hands, who was pulling the strings? The suspicion fell on those with the most to gain from Marielle's death, corrupt political figures who thrived in a system of oppression and violence, and who saw Marielle's activism as a direct threat to their control. The very fact that her murder investigation had faced delays, dead ends, and political interference only fueled the belief that the true mastermind behind the crime remained untouched by the law. The problem was clear. Brazil's justice system, deeply entangled with the same corrupt forces Marielle had fought against, might never reveal the full truth. Lessa and Vieira were behind bars, but the people who gave the order, the ones who orchestrated this assassination, were still free, hiding behind their wealth, influence, and power. The arrests may have removed the triggermen from the streets, but the shadowy figures pulling the strings continued to operate with impunity, shielded by the very system Marielle had spent her life trying to dismantle. And so, even with two men in custody, the real question remained: who really ordered Marielle Franco's murder and why? The answer to that question lies in the heart of Brazil's deeply corrupt political landscape, a landscape where silencing a voice like Marielle's was worth far more than the price of a single bullet. The true mastermind behind Marielle's assassination, still lurking in the shadows, untouched by the law, and perhaps even more dangerous now that their hired hands had been exposed. Justice for Marielle Franco, it seemed, was still far from being served. As the dust settled around the arrests of Ronnie Lessa and Elcio Vieira de Queiroz, one question persisted: who stood to gain from Marielle Franco's death? Theories swirled as investigators, journalists, and activists tried to piece together the motives behind the assassination. What became clear was that her death wasn't a simple act of violence. It was a calculated move in a high-stakes game of power, control, and greed. Marielle's relentless activism and her refusal to back down made her a threat to those who thrived in Brazil's deeply entrenched systems of corruption and violence. So, who had the most to lose from Marielle Franco's growing influence? And more importantly, who had the most to gain by silencing her? Theory 1: Corrupt politicians. Marielle Franco was no stranger to criticizing the political elite, especially those who turned a blind eye to the suffering of Brazil's most marginalized communities. Her vocal opposition to police brutality, her calls for transparency, and her criticism of the increasing militarization of the favelas painted a target on her back. For many corrupt politicians, Marielle wasn't just a nuisance, she was a direct threat to their power and the system that kept them in control. Political power in Brazil is deeply tied to the control of resources and territory, especially in the favelas, where politicians rely on paramilitary groups and corrupt police forces to maintain order. These groups often operate with impunity, extorting the local population, running illegal businesses, and ensuring that certain political figures retain their influence. Marielle's activism, which focused on dismantling these power structures, threatened to expose the very corruption that kept these politicians in office. Expert analysts have pointed out that by advocating for police reform and transparency, Marielle was challenging the political status quo in ways that could have far-reaching consequences. If her calls for reform gained traction, the carefully maintained balance of power, one that benefited politicians connected to these corrupt forces, could be upended. This posed a direct threat to their political survival, making her an obstacle that needed to be removed. Theory 2: Paramilitary Groups. Perhaps the most compelling theory revolves around the involvement of paramilitary groups, often referred to as militias in Brazil. These groups, composed primarily of ex-police officers and former military personnel, operate with near-total control in many of Rio's favelas. Under the guise of offering protection, they engage in extortion, drug trafficking, and illegal land grabbing. Their power is immense, and they often work in collusion with local politicians and corrupt police officers to maintain their grip on these communities. Marielle's activism directly challenged these groups, particularly through her advocacy for the residents of the favelas who were most often their victims. Her efforts to expose the violence and exploitation carried out by the militias made her an enemy of these powerful criminal organizations. She had been vocal in denouncing the way these paramilitary groups operated with impunity, and her position as a city councilwoman gave her a platform to bring these issues to light on a national scale. Many believe that Marielle's murder was a message from these groups, a warning to other activists and politicians who dared to speak out against their control. The precision of her assassination, the involvement of ex-police officers, and the deliberate targeting of a figure as prominent as Marielle suggests that this was more than just a local vendetta. It was a strategic move to silence someone who threatened their business model and the political connections that protected it. Theory 3: High-ranking police officers. The role of the police in Marielle's assassination can't be ignored. Brazil's police force, particularly in Rio de Janeiro, has long been plagued by allegations of corruption and brutality. Many high-ranking officers have deep ties to the militias and benefit from the extortion and criminal activities that take place in the favelas. Marielle's outspoken criticism of police violence made her a direct threat to these officers and the lucrative networks they were a part of. Experts in Brazilian politics have pointed to the possibility that elements within the police force not only condoned but actively participated in Marielle's murder. After all, who better to orchestrate a hit on a politician who was investigating police corruption than those who knew the system inside and out? The involvement of ex-police officers in the assassination adds weight to this theory. It raises the possibility that Marielle was killed not just to silence her, but to protect the interests of high-ranking police officials who stood to lose everything if her investigations and advocacy succeeded. Across all these theories, one theme remains constant: greed and the fear of losing control. Marielle Franco wasn't just challenging individuals, she was threatening entire systems built on exploitation, fear, and corruption. As one political analyst put it, when a powerful voice threatens to expose the rot within a system, those benefiting from that rot will go to great lengths to protect it. But at what cost? The cost of maintaining that control, it seems, was Marielle's life. Whether it was politicians trying to protect their political strongholds, paramilitary groups safeguarding their criminal empires, or corrupt police officers covering their tracks, the assassination of Marielle Franco was about more than silencing one woman. It was about sending a message to anyone who dared to challenge the status quo in Brazil, a message written in blood. Even now, years after her death, these theories continue to swirl. Investigators, journalists, and activists all ask the same question: who really stood to gain from Marielle Franco's murder? The answer to that question lies in the dark intersections of power, greed, and fear, where political survival and criminal interests collide. For those who benefited from the chaos and control that defined Rio's streets, eliminating Marielle wasn't just about silencing her voice. It was about ensuring that the system, rotten as it was, remained intact. But what those responsible for her murder didn't anticipate was that Marielle's voice, though silenced in life, would only grow louder in death. Marielle Franco's assassination did more than take the life of a single woman. It sent shockwaves through Brazil's social and political landscape. The streets of Rio de Janeiro, already burdened by the weight of inequality and violence, erupted in protest after her death. Tens of thousands of people from all walks of life poured into the streets, their faces marked with grief, anger, and a shared sense of injustice. Banners bearing Marielle's image waved above the crowds, while chants of justice for Marielle echoed through the city. But this was no ordinary protest. It was a collective cry from a wounded nation, a people who understood that her death was not just an attack on one person, but on the very fabric of democracy itself. Brazil had long struggled with corruption, police brutality, and political manipulation, but Marielle's murder brought these issues to a boiling point. In a country already teetering on the edge, her assassination felt like a deliberate attempt to extinguish hope, to silence a voice that had become too powerful, too unyielding, too dangerous for those who thrived in the shadows. For the marginalized communities, Marielle fought for Afro-Brazilians, women, LGBTQ plus individuals, and Favela residents. Her death was personal. She was their voice in a system that had ignored them for far too long. To them, Marielle was more than a politician. She was one of their own, someone who had lived their struggles, understood their pain, and refused to stand by while they were oppressed. Her assassination was a stark reminder of the risks faced by those who dared to challenge the status quo. But instead of silencing them, it galvanized a movement. Across Brazil, and even internationally, her death became a rallying cry for activists. It wasn't just the streets of Rio that saw protests, demonstrations in solidarity with Marielle sprang up in major cities around the world. From New York to Paris, from Johannesburg to London, people took to the streets demanding justice. Marielle's assassination struck a chord with activists everywhere, those who recognized in her fight the same struggles they faced in their own countries against racism, against police violence, against political corruption. But the significance of her death went beyond the individual battles she fought. It was a direct attack on Brazil's fragile democracy. Marielle had been a champion of transparency, justice, and accountability, values that form the foundation of any true democracy. Her murder, carried out with cold precision and with the clear backing of powerful forces, was a statement that in Brazil those values could be destroyed with the pull of a trigger. Her death wasn't just the loss of one woman. It was the extinguishing of a light in a country already sinking into darkness. For Brazil's political establishment, her assassination was a wake-up call. The widespread outrage and the international attention it garnered meant that this was not a crime that could be easily swept under the rug. Calls for justice echoed from the streets to the halls of power, with demands for answers growing louder each day. Yet, even as the protests surged, there was a palpable fear among many. Would this be another moment in Brazilian history where justice was denied? Would Marielle's killers and those who ordered her death escape accountability like so many before them? In the months following her death, the Brazilian government struggled to contain the fallout. There were promises of thorough investigations, pledges to bring those responsible to justice. But for the people who had known Marielle, who had marched alongside her in life, these promises felt hollow. The very system that had failed to protect her was now being asked to deliver justice, and for many that seemed an impossible task. But even in the face of doubt and despair, Marielle's death ignited something powerful. The movement she had helped build did not crumble in the wake of her assassination, it grew. Her legacy became a symbol of resistance, not just against her murderers, but against everything she had fought to change. Her name became a rallying cry for a new generation of activists determined to continue her work, to ensure that her death was not in vain. Internationally, her assassination cast a harsh light on the dangers faced by human rights defenders in Brazil. The country had long been one of the most dangerous places in the world for activists, especially those challenging police violence and corruption. Marielle's murder underscored just how high the stakes had become. She was one of the most visible and influential activists in Brazil, and yet even she wasn't safe. Her death sent a chilling message. In Brazil, standing up for the marginalized could cost you your life. Yet the forces that sought to silence her failed to understand one critical thing. Marielle Franco was more than just one voice. She was part of a movement that couldn't be killed with bullets. And as her image became a symbol of hope and defiance, her legacy lived on in the voices of those who continued her fight. In the end, the social and political impact of Marielle Franco's assassination wasn't just about the loss of a single life. It was a reminder of the fragility of democracy in Brazil, a warning that the fight for justice is far from over. But it was also a testament to the resilience of the people she fought for, those who refused to let her death be the final word in a story still being written. In the wake of her assassination, one thing became clear. Marielle's death may have shaken a nation, but it also reignited the flame of resistance, a flame that, despite the darkness surrounding it, would not be easily extinguished. Years have passed since Marielle Franco's brutal assassination, but the quest for justice is far from over. While arrests were made and two men, Ronnie Lessa and Ilcio Vieira de Queiroz, sit behind bars, the burning question still haunts those who knew Marielle, those who walked alongside her in the fight for justice, who ordered the hit, who, in the corridors of power, decided that Marielle's voice had become too dangerous to ignore. For Marielle's family, friends, and supporters, the arrests of these two men have done little to heal the wound left by her murder. Because the truth is, the people who pulled the trigger may have been caught, but those who orchestrated the crime, the masterminds who gave the orders, remain free. And that truth is unbearable for many. It's a truth that Brazil's justice system has yet to fully confront, and it leaves a bitter taste in the mouths of those who continue to demand answers. The investigation has been riddled with delays, dead ends, and suspicions of political interference. Every step forward seems to be met with new roadblocks. The deeper activists and investigators dig, the more it becomes clear that Marielle's assassination wasn't just a simple act of violence, it was a deeply political move protected by those in power. The trail of corruption and complicity wins its way through Brazil's political and security structures, making it difficult to know exactly where it begins and where it ends. And that's where the frustration lies. For Marielle's supporters, justice has been slow, far too slow. The very system she fought against, the system of entrenched corruption and impunity, is now the system tasked with delivering justice for her murder. It's a vicious cycle that leaves many wondering if the full truth will ever be uncovered. Activists around the world have continued to call for transparency, accountability, and the identification of those who truly orchestrated the assassination. For Marielle's family, every day without answers is another day of anguish, another day that the people who ordered her murder walk free, untouched by the law. Their anger, and that of the countless people who march in her name, is not just about the killing of one woman. It's about the profound sense of injustice that still lingers in Brazil, where the powerful seem untouchable and the voices of the oppressed continue to be met with violence. Justice may come slowly, but for Marielle Franco's supporters, it cannot come soon enough. Her name has become a symbol not only of resistance, but of a country's deep, unresolved wounds. And until the day the truth is fully uncovered, until every person responsible for her assassination is held accountable, the fight for justice will continue. Though Marielle Franco was taken from this world in an act of violence, her death has not silenced her. In fact, it has done the opposite. In life, they tried to silence her. But in death, Marielle Franco's voice has only grown louder. Her legacy has become a force that even her murderers could not have anticipated, a symbol of resilience, courage, and the fight for justice. Across Brazil, and indeed the world, Marielle's name has been immortalized. She has become a martyr for the very causes she championed: human rights, racial justice, LGBTQ plus rights, and the fight against police brutality. Her image is carried on banners in protests, painted on murals in cities far beyond Rio de Janeiro, and invoked in political movements that continue to challenge the same systems of oppression she fought against. But Marielle's legacy is not just confined to the streets. It lives on through legislation, activism, and art. In the years since her assassination, countless activists and politicians have carried forward her work, pushing for the same reforms she so passionately advocated for. Laws have been proposed in her name, aiming to address the issues of police violence and corruption that she fought to expose. And more than that, her life has inspired a new generation of activists, women, Afro-Brazilians, LGBTQ plus individuals who see in her a beacon of hope, a reminder that their voices too matter. In many ways, Marielle's murder backfired on those who sought to erase her. Rather than extinguishing her voice, her assassination amplified it. Her death became a rallying cry, a point of convergence for the many struggles she represented. And in her martyrdom, the very causes her enemies tried to suppress have gained even more strength. Internationally, Marielle Franco has become a symbol of the global fight for human rights. Her name is now synonymous with resistance against state violence, against the oppression of marginalized communities, and against the unchecked power of corrupt governments. She is remembered not only as a politician, but as a movement that refuses to die, no matter how many bullets are fired. Her legacy is one of enduring influence. Every protest that rises against injustice, every movement that demands equality, every voice that speaks out for the marginalized, they all carry a piece of Marielle with them. Her work didn't end on the night she was assassinated. In many ways, it began anew. And so, as Brazil and the world continues to grapple with the unanswered questions surrounding her death, one thing remains certain. Marielle Franco's legacy will live on. It will continue to inspire, to challenge, and to push for the change that she so fiercely believed in. Her killers may have taken her life, but they could never take her voice. And that voice, now carried by millions, is louder than ever.